Imagine a war defined not by a clear enemy or a distinct front line, but by a profound cognitive failure.
Right?
A conflict where noble intentions collide head-on with a reality that was never fully understood. It is a story not just of soldiers and strategy, but of a tragedy, a sort of failed crusade. Today, we are looking at the book that defined how a generation understood that conflict.
I mean, it really set the standard.
Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment. Should you read this book? This should help. Also excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
And just so you're aware, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Today we are taking on a massive subject, Vietnam, a history by Stanley Karnow.
Massive is the right word for it.
If you have a bookshelf dedicated to history, this spine is probably on it. It is thick, it is comprehensive, and for decades it has been considered the standard account of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, standard, but not necessarily undisputed.
Right. But we aren't here to just recount the dates and battles, are we?
Not at all. Our mission today is to look under the hood. We want to investigate how Karnow constructed this definitive narrative.
Because it really is a construction.
Exactly. We need to explore how he framed the war as a cosmic tragedy rather than, say, a crime or a successful revolution, because that framing changed how millions of people thought about the war.
It is interesting you use the word constructed. We tend to think of history books as just buckets of facts.
Just dumping data on the page.
Right. But you are arguing, well, our analysis is arguing that Karnow is doing something more active. He is building a specific argument to persuade us.
He is reforming a kind of cultural mediation. You have to remember this book was published in the early 1980s.
The wound was still very fresh.
So fresh. America was deeply divided. Karnow had to write a history that could be read by both the hawk who supported the war and the dove who protested it.
That is a really tough tightrope to walk.
It requires a very specific architecture of credibility.
So let's unpack this architecture. How does he get us to trust him? When you open a book this heavy, literally and metaphorically, you need to believe the guy writing it knows his stuff. What is his angle?
This comes down to what rhetoricians call ethos, his persona. Karnow positions himself very carefully. He isn't an academic sitting in an ivory tower analyzing data sets effectively from a distance.
He creates a totally different character for himself.
Right. He is not a professor.
He is the guy in the trench coat.
That is the image, exactly.
Yeah.
He adopts the persona of the world-weary correspondent. The analysis notes that he builds his ethos as a witness.
Because he was actually there.
Yes, he covered Indochina for major U.S. outlets like Time and Life magazines. He isn't just reciting history. He's telling you what he saw with his own eyes.
That I was there quality makes a huge difference. It feels visceral. It makes the reader feel like they are getting the gritty truth, not just the official report.
It builds an immediate bond of trust.
But he also claims to have the view from the high towers, right? Not just the trenches.
That is the second pillar of his credibility, inside access. The book is famous for referencing secret documents and exclusive interviews.
He didn't just talk to the grunts on the ground.
No, he talked to the policymakers in Washington and, crucially, the leaders in Vietnam.
I remember reading about that. He actually interviewed figures on all sides.
Yes, including North Vietnamese leaders like General Tran Du. Think about the impact of that in the 1980s.
That would be massive.
By weaving in these voices, he creates an appearance of total coverage. It signals to the reader, I have seen the secret files, I have spoken to the enemy, and now I'm going to explain it to you.
It creates a complete 360-degree illusion of authority.
It is a massive power move.
But that authority leads to a specific tone. It feels very well. It feels balanced, almost aggressively moderate.
That is entirely by design. As the analysis of the text points out, Karnow adopts a moderate liberal tone.
Occupying the middle ground?
Exactly. On one hand, he criticizes what he calls antiquated Marxist ideology among the communists.
And on the other?
On the other, he slams American hubris and bureaucratic ignorance.
So he is scolding everyone equally. It is the a plague on both your houses approach.
Precisely. This middle-of-the-road approach appeals strongly to centrist readers. It makes the author appear completely objective.
But
But, and here's where the analysis gets really interesting, critics suggest that this objectivity might actually mask a specific ideological slant.
how so?
By refusing to take a hard side, he creates a safe space for the mainstream reader to process the war without feeling implicated in a crime.
That is a really fascinating point. It is like, if everyone is wrong, then no one is uniquely evil.
Exactly.
It becomes a tragedy of errors rather than a moral failing. It literally lets the reader off the hook.
It does. And that feeling of tragedy isn't just in the tone. It is built into the structure of the book itself.
Right, the Greek tragedy angle. I notice he doesn't start with the 1960s or Lyndon Johnson. He goes way, way back.
He starts with the heritage of Vietnamese nationalism. He goes back centuries.
This feels like a very significant structural choice.
It is. He is arguing against that common American habit of seeing Vietnam as a war that just popped up out of nowhere in the 1960s.
He is saying, you guys walked into a movie that had been playing for 1,000 years.
Exactly. By framing the U.S. phase as just one brief episode in a long history of resistance against China, France, and Japan, and during World War II, he minimizes the uniqueness of the American intervention.
It becomes just another wave crashing against the Vietnamese shore.
It feels inevitable.
And when he does get to the American war, the focus shifts. I mean, I was expecting a lot of taking the hill and helicopter maneuvers, the sort of action we see in movies like Platoon.
But the book feels much more political.
Very political.
The analysis highlights this explicit focus on the political over the military. The battles are sketched relatively lightly.
The real action, for Karnow, happens in the rooms where decisions are made.
Yes, it is about policy debates, political calculations, and diplomatic maneuvering.
It feels like a stage play. You have the actors on stage making speeches while the actual war happens offstage.
That is a fantastic analogy. The chapters covering the coup against Diem, the escalation, the Tet Offensive, the Nixon years, they really function like acts in a tragedy.
Each step creates a sense of inevitability.
You watch these leaders, Johnson, McNamara, Nixon, make decisions that continually narrow their options. You really feel the fatalism.
And central to that tragedy is the idea of blindness. That seems to be the main theme driving everything.
Yes, the metaphor of misperception is the book's central logos, or logical argument.
Okay, break that down for me.
As Karnow presents it, the war wasn't lost because the U.S. lacked firepower.
I mean, we had plenty of that.
Right, it was lost because of a profound mismatch.
A mismatch between what we thought was happening and what was actually happening.
Correct. American leaders were operating on Cold War assumptions, specifically the domino theory.
Let's pause there for a second. We hear domino theory all the time, but in this specific context, what does it actually mean for the people making the decisions?
It is the idea that nations are like a row of dominoes standing on end.
If one falls,
If one country falls to communism, the force of that fall will inevitably knock over the next one and then the next. If Vietnam falls, then Laos goes, then Cambodia, then Thailand, all the way to India.
So they weren't looking at Vietnam as a distinct country. They were looking at it as a tile in a game.
Precisely. The U.S. saw a global chessboard. The Vietnamese saw a fight for their homeland.
Two completely different realities.
Karnow argues that the reality on the ground was about local nationalism. And that cognitive failure, that blindness to local realities, is what Karnow identifies as the root of the disaster.
It is a powerful framework. It forces us to look at how we interpret history and how easily we can misunderstand the world if we rely on the wrong mental models.
It really does. And speaking of sharpening your mental models and ensuring you are looking at the world clearly, we want to mention a great resource.
Yes, we are referring to Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
It is a fantastic place to go if you want to gain knowledge quickly but thoroughly, just like we are doing here. So definitely go check out Mindful Moments.
Now let's get back to Karnow. We have established his credibility and his tragic framework, but this is where I want to push back a little bit.
Let's hear it.
We are doing an extended analysis of the material, so we need to look at what is lurking beneath that smooth narrative. Because not everyone agrees with Karnow, do they?
Far from it. While this is the standard history, it has faced fierce criticism from both the left and the right.
Let's talk about the nobody won thesis. This is probably one of Karnow's most famous lines, right? That the Vietnam War was a war nobody won.
It is definitely the line that defines the book's legacy. But the analysis we are using today challenges that claim significantly.
I have to be honest, when I read that, I paused. Because technically, didn't someone win? I mean, the tanks rolled into Saigon, the flag changed, the map was literally redrawn.
You are absolutely right to question that. The Vietnamese communists won.
Right.
They achieved their strategic objective, the unification of the country under their control, and the expulsion of foreign powers.
Which is the definition of a victory.
Exactly. Now, their victory had brutal consequences,
Yeah.
re-education camps, severe economic hardship, the massive refugee crisis, but militarily and politically, they won.
So why does Karnow call it a war nobody won? Is he just ignoring the scoreboard?
Our sources suggest it's a rhetorical tactic.
A tactic to do what?
Calling it a tragedy or saying nobody won universalizes the suffering. It comforts the American reader.
Ah, if nobody won, then the American defeat stings a little less.
It suggests that the war was just a terrible waste for everyone, rather than a clear, definitive victory for the other side.
It removes the sting of defeat. It is almost like saying, well, it was a pie because everyone is sad.
That is a cynical, but very accurate way to put it. It helps heal the American psyche, but
Yeah.
it completely obscures the historical reality that one side achieved its goals and the other did not.
That makes total sense.
And that leads to another major critique found in the sources, the North versus South frame.
What do you mean by that?
Karnow often frames the conflict as North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, with the U.S. simply coming in to help the South.
But critics argue this is misleading.
Very misleading. It frames the war as a civil war between two equal sovereign states,
Instead of what? What is the alternative view?
instead of an American war against a Southern revolutionary movement, the Viet Cong, that was being supported by the North. By framing it as North versus South, it subtly shifts responsibility away from the U.S. It makes the U.S. look like a helpful ally caught in a neighbor's dispute.
Rather than the primary driver of the conflict for many years.
Exactly.
That is a subtle but huge distinction. It completely changes how you see the agency of the people in the South who were fighting against the U.S.
It flattens their agency entirely. It turns them into mere pawns of the North, rather than revolutionaries in their own right.
And this connects to how the book handles violence, doesn't it? The analysis notes a distinct asymmetry of violence in the text.
Yes. The way violence is described is very telling.
I noticed that. The descriptions of communist atrocities are incredibly specific.
They are. The massacre at Hue during the Tet Offensive, for example, is treated bluntly and vividly. You see the cruelty, you see the faces, you see the executions.
But when it comes to U.S. violence, especially the bombing of rural populations or the destruction of villages with napalm, the language completely changes.
It becomes much more bureaucratic.
Or like it is just paperwork.
It is treated as structural or accidental. It is collateral damage or the result of clumsy policy.
The analysis suggests that this asymmetry shapes the reader's moral perception without explicit editorializing.
That is the key. We feel the horror of the communist crimes personally.
But we view the American devastation as a tragic mistake of a giant machine.
So one is a horror movie and the other is a spreadsheet.
That is a very powerful way to visualize it, and that leads us perfectly to the noble but illusory trap.
Right. Karnow portrays U.S. motives as noble intentions that simply went wrong.
And that is the core debate. Because if I drive drunk and hit someone, that is a crime. If I try to swerve to avoid a squirrel and hit someone, that is an accident. Karnow seems to be arguing for the accident.
Radical critics argue that calling the motives noble but mistaken effectively lets the U.S. completely off the hook.
It naturalizes imperial self-interest as merely clumsy benevolence.
It suggests we were just trying to do good but messed up, rather than asking deeper questions about why we felt entitled to intervene in the first place.
It is the difference between a manslaughter charge and a murder charge. One is a tragic mistake, the other is a deliberate crime.
And Karnow seems to plead geopolitical manslaughter.
That is a very apt way to put it, geopolitical manslaughter.
So let's step back and look at the story itself.
We have talked about the framing and the criticism, but what is the actual narrative arc that Karnow builds? If you sit down to read these 700 pages, what is the journey?
Well, keeping our focus on the summary portion of our analysis, the story flows chronologically, but it is built on a downward slope.
It begins with the vacuum left by the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu.
The French exit and the Americans enter.
And they enter driven by fears of credibility, right?
Yes, the narrative progression is all about deepening entanglement. You see Eisenhower, then Kennedy, then Johnson.
They all seem trapped by their own rhetoric.
Exactly. They can't look weak, so they take one more step into the swamp.
And as you mentioned earlier, the focus is heavily on the elites.
The key dynamic is that these massive decisions are happening in air-conditioned rooms in Washington or Saigon.
Meanwhile, the reality on the ground, the intense nationalism, the jungle, the guerrilla tactics, it drifts further and further away from their understanding.
It creates this incredible tension for the reader. You're reading it, and you want to scream at the page, don't you see what's happening?
And then comes Tet.
The Tet Offensive in 1968 is the major pivot point in the book.
Karnow portrays it not just as a military event, but as the moment the psychological trap snaps shut.
The American public finally sees that the war is not almost over, as they were repeatedly told. The grand illusion breaks.
And from there, it is the long, slow slide under Nixon.
What the analysis calls the tragic momentum.
The narrative moves toward the end not as a dramatic military shift, but as a severe narrowing of options.
It is the feeling of a closing trap.
We won't spoil the specific fates of the characters or the final evacuation scenes for those who haven't read it, but the overwhelming feeling Karnow leaves you with is one of exhaustion and waste. Yeah. Total exhaustion.
So here is the big question. Why does this matter today?
It is a fair question.
Why should someone listening to this analysis go out and read a massive book from the 1980s about a war that ended 50 years ago?
Because, as the analysis powerfully highlights, Vietnam, a history is a masterclass in the dangers of abstract geopolitical thinking.
Abstract geopolitical thinking, meaning looking at the world as a game of risk rather than real people.
Exactly. The key lesson here is that nations should absolutely not entangle themselves in conflict where they do not understand the local context, history, or culture.
If you treat a country as a domino, just a piece in a larger game, you miss the fact that it is a nation with its own dreams, its own history, and its own agency.
And we see that pattern repeating, don't we?
All the time. We constantly see leaders making decisions based on global theories rather than local realities.
We certainly do. That is exactly why the book remains so relevant today.
Despite its limitations, right? Despite the American-centered lens or its potential equivocation on morality, it serves as a monumental cautionary tale.
It is accessible, it is comprehensive, and it reminds us what happens when hubris blinds leadership to reality.
It is a loud warning to check your assumptions at the door.
Precisely. It challenges us to ask, what are the domino theories of our own time?
What are the things we think we know that are actually blinding us to what is really happening?
So as we wrap up this conversation on Stanley Karnow's Vietnam, a history, we want to leave you with a thought to chew on.
We have discussed how Karnow frames the war as a tragedy, but I want you to ask yourself, when we label a war a tragedy, are we expressing deep empathy, or are we secretly avoiding the much harder work of assigning responsibility?
Does calling it a mistake hide the fact that it was a choice? That is a heavy question, but that is what history is for. It is not just about the past. It is about how we explain ourselves to ourselves. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.